Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Washington Brief for Tuesday, December 5. It is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Michael Jenkins, president of the Washington Times Foundation, which sponsors this webcast. Dr. Jenkins is also chairman of the Washington Times Holdings, the LLC that owns the Times news organization. He has led many successful fact-finding trips to Korea for policy experts and peace initiatives to the Middle East for the Universal Peace Federation. Dr. Jenkins, welcome.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you for your fine work with the Washington Brief. We're very grateful to be here for this program. The Biden-Xi summit just occurred recently, and we're going to be covering that. And we're just really, the title is the Biden-Xi summit a win-win or a lose-lose? Our panelists and moderator are just experts in the field of intelligence and also communications and security. Dr. Alexandre Mansourov is an adjunct professor of security studies at the Edmund A. Walsh School for Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He also is an adjunct professor of Korean studies at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University and the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. Welcome, Dr. Mansourov. And our moderator, as always, is Ambassador Joseph DeTrani. Ambassador DeTrani is a widely respected commentator on security issues. Formerly, Ambassador DeTrani was special envoy for the six-party talks with North Korea, which we believe really advanced the foundation of relationship, and it still is going on in back channels. He's also been the director of the National Counterproliferation Center and Associate Director of National Intelligence. Our guest today, our guest panelist is Mr. Guy Taylor. Guy is a national security team leader for the Washington Times news organization. He currently oversees the Times State Department and intelligence community coverage. He holds a MS degree in security studies from Angelo State University in Texas, and as a veteran Korean watcher, his exhaustive coverage of the U.S. policy toward North Korea has won accolades from across the political spectrum. Among numerous awards, his reporting on Russia's attempts to influence the 2016 U.S. election was recognized with the Gerald R. Ford Journalism Prize for distinguished reporting on the presidency. I'll turn it over to our moderator, Ambassador Joseph DeTrani. Welcome, Ambassador.
Thank you, Dr. Jenkins. Thank you. We're very fortunate to have Guy Taylor with us. Guy really knows East Asia. He knows the region. He knows national security writ large. So this should be a great discussion. Look, this past month has been filled with lots of geostrategic issues that we will be looking to Guy to help us better understand. And we'll ask him some questions about that. I mean, certainly as Dr. Jenkins indicated, the summit between President Joe Biden and Xi Jinping was very significant. I mean, 4 hours of discussions, an agreement on communications, reestablishing communications, mill to mill, leadership to leadership communications. Certainly, this is something we need to ensure that we don't stumble into conflict. And also the whole issue of fentanyl and ensuring that precursor chemicals do not leave China and arrive in other countries so that these chemicals, these precursors, are produced so that fentanyl arrives in the United States, killing thousands and thousands of Americans. These are just some of the issues that the Biden and Xi summit discussed, and we'll be drilling down on that. But also on North Korea, they just recently put a satellite in orbit, a reconnaissance satellite, something they've tried to do in the past. They've had 2 failures, and now this was a success. So this is major, and a lot of tension between South Korea and North Korea. So there's a lot to discuss, and we look to Guy Taylor to better inform us as to what's happening in the region. Guy, over to you.
Oh, thank you, Larry Moffett, Dr. Michael Jenkins, Dr. Mansourov, Ambassador DeTrani. It's good to see you all. Thanks to the Washington Times Foundation. It's always an incredible honor for me as a national security journalist, closely covering and writing about topics that get discussed every month in this unique forum to have a chance to then be invited here to present what I'm seeing, especially given the long list of amazing presenters that you guys have here on the Washington Brief. You know, just during recent months, you had Ambassador Robert Joseph, Greg Scarlatoux, Sid Seiler, Daniel Hoffman. That's to name a few. These are big shoes to follow, but as you all know, I like to bring a special big picture perspective that I have on the global information space as a journalist. And I can comfortably say that the summit between President Biden and President Xi was definitely an event where big picture thinking is valuable and I think particularly necessary given the steady increase in great power tension between the U.S. and China that we've all been watching unfold across really the entire the diplomatic, informational, military, and economic realms over the past 10 years, especially. And with regard to the basic question of was this 4+ hour Biden-Xi meeting in California on the sidelines of APEC, okay, the annual Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Leaders Summit, was the Biden-Xi meeting a success, a failure, a win-win, a lose-lose? More pointedly, did it result in an increase in U.S. China tension and the prospect of a meltdown toward war between the two great powers? Or was there a decrease in such tension? And I think we have to take stock of where we were in the bigger global media and information space during the 4 weeks leading up to the November 15th summit. Consider that in the wake of Hamas's early October terror assault on Israel and the outbreak of a new potentially spiraling hot war in the Middle East, at a moment when a hot war is already simultaneously raging in Eastern Europe, we were seeing a surge in analysis and media articles. I actually wrote one myself for the Washington Times about this suddenly very palpable prospect or fear that humanity was closer than it has been in many decades to world war, a kind of worst case scenario where the Israeli-Palestinian clash could escalate regionally and then balloon into a global conflagration in which Russia and China might both militarily align behind Iran and its proxies against Israel, the U.S., and a network of Western allies, with middle powers such as Turkey and Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and others being forced to choose sides, all while the prospect loomed of a third hot war front opening up in East Asia if China sought to seize the moment by trying to suddenly militarily annex Taiwan, or if the North Korean regime decided to engage in a major nuclear provocation. This was the sort of tip of the spear of global security analysis and concern that was running very high in the weeks before Biden, Xi, and Xi Jinping came together in California. So if we consider how now in the wake of the summit, that big global narrative or fear of world war, it has cooled down a bit. Of course, there continues to be robust discussion in Washington over what Ambassador Robert Joseph recently coined right here in this forum as a rising axis of authoritarians, the growing China, Russia, Iran, North Korea alignment and alliance with authoritarian communist China leading the charge in challenging and undermining U.S. power and efforts to maintain stability throughout the free world. But what we saw in California was the two top leaders of this very tense new world order come together in diplomatic fashion for really a peaceful, albeit tense and high stakes, a peaceful meeting of great power rivals. And that resulted quickly in the generation of quite a bit of calm media analysis and narratives, not about a shift closer to the edge of world war, but more about the complex realism of the U.S.-China relationship and how perhaps world war is very avoidable if there is diplomacy between the two biggest, most powerful rivals. And in that sense, I think the Biden-Xi summit was a success. Now, was it productive in terms of tangible deliverables that could ease or escalate tensions in the relationship going forward. Was it a win-win or a lose-lose? Or she politically on the international stage or in terms of domestic Chinese or American perceptions, that still remains to be seen. And before we debate that for the rest of the hour here, let's look at, dig in here to some of the specifics. Biden and Xi agreed at the summit to begin the process of restoring military to military communications between their armed forces. Biden hailed this agreement by saying, quote, "We're back to direct, open, clear communications." That's probably an overstatement, and the jury is still out on this. After the summit was over, administration officials said privately that the agreement means Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin could potentially meet in person with his Chinese counterpart. The problem there is that the Chinese counterpart has not been named. And the agreement also opens the way for deeper re-engagement of discussions between the Pentagon's Indo-Pacific commander, Admiral John Aquilino, and his Chinese counterpart. Remember, in August, the Pentagon announced that Aquilino had held some limited interaction with Chinese defense officials at a summit in Fiji. But really, it's been about 15 months, well over a year, since Beijing halted any direct, mid, or high-level military-to-military meetings and discussions with the United States. And the idea of restarting those meetings and keeping military communication lines open is vital to avoiding miscalculation and accidents that could lead to spiraling escalation in the very tense waters around the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea, where U.S. and Chinese warships are in close proximity to each other. And the number of near misses, or what the Pentagon calls unsafe and unprofessional incidents involving Chinese naval assets, has risen dramatically in recent years. So the Biden-Xi agreement, I think it showed that Beijing is of a common mind that the lack of steady open communication channels is dangerous. But again, we're all waiting now for news that some actual action toward dialogue is happening, and we haven't seen it yet. What we saw in late November was actually the opposite. Instead of announcements of an Aquilino or Austin summit with their Chinese counterparts, we saw a very senior People's Liberation Army spokesman make global headlines, really, by accusing the United States of engaging in navigation hegemony after a U.S. Navy warship conducted a freedom of navigation voyage in the South China Sea. So I'm hopeful about the mill-to-mill comms announcement, but we're really in a wait and see with regard to where it goes. Another key point in the summit was a potential breakthrough toward U.S. China coordination on combating the fentanyl crisis. China is the source of most of the precursor chemicals that get shipped legally and illegally in vast amounts to Mexico and result in pretty massive illegal smuggling of the actual fentanyl drug. Really, this is the most potent synthetic opioid into the United States, which is experiencing a deadly fentanyl overdose epidemic. And Xi Jinping indicated at the summit that Beijing will try to work with the U.S. toward cracking down on companies in China that produce the precursor chemicals illegally. In exchange, Biden agreed to lift some U.S. sanctions on a couple of key Chinese government institutions that Washington had previously targeted with economic sanctions on the accusation that those institutions are engaged in human rights violations against ethnic minorities in China, specifically Uyghur Muslims. That was a bit of a back and forth. President Biden framed the fentanyl discussion as a big victory, but whether it really is win-win or win-lose is debatable. I think that if there actually is a Chinese government push to crack down on fentanyl precursors over the coming months, it could over time have a pretty dramatic impact on the organized crime and drug overdose crisis stemming from fentanyl in the U.S. and in Mexico. Having some positive leader level agreement, it's a start. Another big point in the summit was on Taiwan. Heading into the summit, there were signals that Xi wanted Biden to make clear that the U.S. remains committed to the one China policy. Of course, this is a vague policy that has always involved strategic ambiguity on the part of the United States, but China has a history of portraying any U.S. leader pronouncements on the one China policy to be indications that Washington accepts Beijing's position that there is only one China and that Taiwan is part of China. Obviously, when we look at real U.S. policy, we see Washington arming Taiwan, standing up for Taiwanese democracy and self-rule or autonomy, albeit without actually recognizing Taiwanese independence. The point here is that Biden, who has drawn attention in recent years by saying the U.S. would militarily back Taiwan if China attacked the island, he came through on Xi Jinping's wish in the summit by emphasizing the U.S. recognition or adherence to the one China policy has not changed. Notably, after the summit, Sarah Barron, the Biden administration's National Security Council senior director for China and Taiwan, she talked to reporters about emphasizing that the U.S. policy remains, and I quote, no support for Taiwan independence. In essence, that's exactly what Xi and the Chinese Communist Party wanted to hear. So that could be viewed as a win for Xi Jinping. However, there was a lot of nuance on the Taiwan issue at the summit. U.S. officials said privately afterwards that Xi at one point claimed not to know anything about any Chinese military preparations to possibly seize Taiwan by force. This was kind of controversial because China has consistently ramped up military exercises around Taiwan in recent years, exercises that Taiwanese officials say are practice for an invasion. And Xi himself has, during multiple past speeches, said that China could use force if necessary to bring Taiwan under the control of Beijing. Interestingly, President Xi also described Taiwan during the summit as potentially the most dangerous issue in the U.S. China relationship. This is, of course, not novel. There are plenty of U.S. military analysts who've made similar assessments or pronouncements in recent years. It's also, I think, worth noting that the official White House statement after the summit said that President Biden did explicitly call for restraint in China's use of military activity in and around the Taiwan Strait. But even there, Biden's posture and language on Taiwan were cautious, careful, delicate, almost as if he was really eagerly placating Xi Jinping. Another example was the lack of any mention in the White House statement of U.S. arms sales to Taiwan or military support for Taiwan. That was another issue that China was seen ahead of the summit to be hoping that Biden would stay quiet about or not make threatening comments on, and he did not. And from the Chinese side, the official Chinese government statement after the summit claimed that Xi had actually gone so far as to tell Biden directly that the U.S. should stop arming Taiwan. So there was a lot of kind of tension there, and I think one of the key nuances on the Taiwan issue to watch going forward is the January presidential election in Taiwan, and the extent to which Beijing meddles or attempts to meddle in the election. Right now, there are signs that parties who are seen to be backed by China are likely to lose, which would mean a continuance of Democratic Progressive Party rule in Taipei. Remember, the current DPP government of Taiwanese President Tsai has pushed back against Beijing's bullying over the past 7 years. And so I think we should watch how Beijing responds to the election or makes any military provocations in the Taiwan Strait in the weeks before the election, and whether the outcome in January triggers a new escalation of tensions with Washington. Moving on, I think it's instructive to point out some elephants in the room, or we could say some elephants that apparently weren't in the room during the summit. There was very little discussion on North Korea. The official White House statement on the summit said President Biden emphasized the U.S. commitment to the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, but The official statement actually made zero mention of the words North Korea or the North Korea-China relationship, or the notion that China, which is North Korea's predominant economic and geopolitical ally, could, or it should be playing a more productive role in working toward that denuclearization goal. There was also no mention in the official U.S. statement of dangerously growing China-Russia relations. Actually, the word Russia appears only once in the White House statement on the summit, and that was on how President Biden told President Xi that the U.S. remains committed to supporting Ukraine's defense against Russian aggression. Interestingly, while there was no mention in the official White House statement, there was a post-summit briefing with some journalists, and Biden administration National Security Council officials claimed that President Biden had actually raised concerns directly to Xi Jinping about China's support for Russia's war. But when asked, specifically whether Biden sought Xi's cooperation on the North Korea issue, or whether he specifically raised any concerns about North Korea-Russia military cooperation, remember, North Korea is at this point providing arms for Russian troops in Ukraine. National Security Council officials sort of dodged that question, basically saying, well, look, administration officials have raised these issues in other meetings repeatedly, but not necessarily indicating that these issues got discussed at all during the 4-hour Biden-Xi summit. It goes without saying then that other contentious points regarding China, Russia, Iran, North Korea alignment also got left out of the discussion. Most notably, there was no mention of China's ongoing purchase of vast amounts of oil from Iran, essentially in violation of U.S. sanctions on the Iranian energy sector, and the extent to which China, perhaps because of that arrangement with Iran, let alone the blind eye that the Biden administration turns on China's Iranian oil purchases, that China could maybe be in a position to exert influence over Tehran vis-a-vis the Iranian regime's support and funding of groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. The notion that the Biden administration could have perhaps threatened to level new sanctions directly on Chinese companies involved in the Iran oil trade, unless China made perhaps public statements condemning Hamas or condemning Iranian belligerence toward Israel. That type of dialogue or posturing did not occur at the Biden-Xi summit in California. Another elephant missing from the room was what I like to describe as the semiconductor trade war. Specifically, Biden administration efforts to steer global microchip manufacturing and supply lines away from China, and the U.S. allegation that Chinese companies engage in pretty rampant theft of high-tech intellectual property from American companies, European companies, and Asian companies as well. These issues were not discussed in detail. Instead, there was a broad White House statement that Biden and Xi affirmed the need to address risks of advanced artificial intelligence systems and to improve AI safety through U.S. China government talks. That's an important statement, but it's so broad that it risks being meaningless. There was also a lack of meat on the bones, so to speak, on some specific trade disputes that are pretty hot right now. For instance, China is the world's top producer of graphite. This is one of the most important raw materials that's really essential in the manufacture of batteries for electronic vehicles. China actually signaled a couple of weeks before the California summit that it plans to begin restricting graphite exports to the U.S., most likely as retaliation to the Biden administration's ongoing attempt to restrict global exports of advanced semiconductors to China. The White House and the Chinese statements on the summit did not mention any serious discussion on this dispute. And it's important to note that there was not a joint statement after the summit. There were separate statements, which always leaves open the possibility of different interpretations of what actually went on behind closed doors for 4 hours. Let's just kind of wrap it up here by looking a little bit at that question of whether the summit was a win or loss for Biden or Xi personally. It's important to consider that President Xi is under significant pressure at home amid an economic crisis that is squeezing China from within right now. economic strain that's really entangled with what was the Communist Party government's heavy-handed COVID-19 lockdowns. Remember, the lockdowns in China really only ended in early 2023, much later than the US and really the rest of the world, as well as China's just messy and non-transparent response to the emergence or origins of COVID to begin with. It's particularly notable that Xi Jinping has not been present at major summits or events on the world stage since really before COVID. He most recently missed the G20 in New Delhi, a massively important summit that's outside the United States, a chance for developing world leaders to kind of be on the stage together without the U.S. He wasn't, or even with the U.S. present, but he wasn't there. And he also was not present in September at the UN General Assembly in New York. And inside China, I think it can fairly be argued that there's real concern that Xi Jinping's decade in power has not advanced China economically. So President Xi needed to show the Chinese people that he's trying, he's back out in the world. He's doing something big. He's reaching out to the United States, trying to keep U.S. manufacturing in China, trying to keep U.S. financial investment flowing into China, despite the great ideological divide between Beijing and Washington, while also trying to show the world that, hey, here's Xi Jinping, the sort of highest profile guest at APEC, to show that China's leader and China itself remain in a strong position, or to break down any global or Western media narrative that something major is wrong in China. I think that was an important goal for Xi. And there was, potential wins for Xi in just showing up. And then, of course, in getting the conciliatory rhetoric out of President Biden on the Taiwan issue and creating the appearance that the U.S. knows better than to make negative spectacles of China or to bully China over Israel, Russia, Ukraine, Iran, North Korea, microchips, or any other issue. And then, for President Biden, there's both a win and a loss at play. On one hand, he's been relatively present at major world leader summits since COVID. And here he had an opportunity to promote the United States as being in control of the great power competition between the U.S. and China, or just in control of the U.S.-China relationship, because here Xi Jinping had to come to California to kiss the ring, so to speak. I know that's kind of inflammatory language, is probably going too far, but the point being that Biden suffers pretty badly from a narrative that he's personally weak or elderly and soft, and that this was a chance to show that he's in control. Of course, the loss here being that Biden, I think, actually exposed himself by missing a chance to take firmer stances on China's role in supporting Russia, China's role in supporting North Korea, China's relationship with Iran. And it's not clear that any real leverage was exerted by the U.S. side with regard to the Taiwan issue or the two major deliverables, the military-to-military comms and the fentanyl coordination. As I've said, the jury's really still out on whether any true tangibles come out of either of those. So to wrap up here, look, there's the success of laying the ground for peaceful dialogue between the U.S. and China. That was the main achievement of the summit. I think it should not be understated, especially at a moment where there seems to only be rising tension. Remember, it was actually less than a year ago that a U.S. fighter jet shot down an alleged Chinese spy balloon that had captivated the American media and sent fears across the country because it traversed North America, allegedly, and we could debate this, soaking up intelligence from very sensitive U.S. military sites. That was in February, so a lot of high tensions there. I think that both Republicans, Democrats, both sides in the United States agree that the era of great economic joint venture between the U.S. capitalist democracy and communist China, it's a thing of the past in today's world. But the two countries actually, in realist terms, still do have very significant economic engagement. And the summit showed that both also seem committed to peaceful leader level dialogue, if only to steer off the path of potential war or to pursue diplomacy and regular talks toward working out their economic and security differences or working through them and coordinating on things like battling pollution, the climate change, and hopefully, in conclusion, on working to prevent the spread of wars. So I'm very interested in hearing from you, Ambassador DeTrani, you, Dr. Mansourov, Dr. Jenkins. I'm sure there's some takeaways from the summit that I missed here, but I'm hoping we can dig into all of it.
Well,
Thank
Guy,
you.
no, that was very, very thorough, Guy. There's so much to unpack on that. You talked about the fentanyl agreement, the mill-to-mill agreement, talking about Taiwan, talking about some other issues. But I think the main piece that I take away from your presentation, a very excellent presentation, is that at least we're communicating. Our leaders are communicating, and we're trying to defuse some of this tension that could spill over into accidental conflict. So there's a lot to unpack, and I'll look to Dr. Mansourov. Dr. Mansourov.
Thank you, and hello, everyone. Guy, what a fantastic presentation. Actually, I have to tear apart my notes and go home now because you covered it all. There's really nothing for me of substance to add, but I'll try. And I'll start by saying that I agree with you that the global order is facing severe challenges. And one reason for that is the rise of another superpower, which a real contender, strategic contender of the United States. Because China not only has trade more than $750 billion with the United States, but it's the largest trading partner of over 120 countries around the world. Not the U.S., but China. It has the largest navy in the world, believe it or not. It has the largest, second largest defense budget in the world. And as you correctly pointed out, it does pose the greatest enduring threat to the Western values and the U.S. national interests in the around the world. So that said, let's talk a little bit about the summit. And I would like you to put it for us in the historical perspective of previous summits between the United States and another now defunct superpower, the Soviet Union, during the Cold War. I mean, would you see that Biden-Xi summit getting up there into the stratosphere, or do you see it as something of less significance? Clearly, that summit, the Biden-Xi summit, signaled detente in the relationship between the two countries. And one of my questions really is whether President Xi came, why is he interested in detente with the United States? You alluded to it on a couple of issues, and I want you to kind of amplify your point. I mean, did he come from the position of weakness? And you mentioned, I mean, he's facing political troubles at home. I mean, his foreign minister disappeared, defense minister disappeared, his former prime minister passed away unexpectedly at a fairly young age. I mean, clearly there is some political turmoil in China. I mean, he has to deal with worsening economic situation, as you mentioned, and during his 10-year rule. I mean, the Chinese people do not look like, having a better life today than they did 10 years ago, at least in economic terms. Again, he has to deal with aggravating geopolitical tensions, which kind of getting worse and worse day by day. And, they appear to be damaging Chinese interests around the world and setting back the One Belt, One Road initiative. Now, in that sense, if he did come from a position of, if he is interested in detente in the U.S.-Chinese relationship from a position of weakness, then your portrayal of this visit as a trip to kiss the ring, to kind of put it bluntly, would not be an exaggeration, although I'm sure a lot of people will disagree with it. Or is he interested in the overall detente and the strategic relationship from a position of strength? Because as some people said, Xi came to Washington to make sure that the next leader of the United States recognizes Chinese interests and is aligned with Chinese policies. So, if anything, possible successor to the Democratic leadership, Democratic Party leadership, the United States, even presidency was introduced to him. Governor of California, Newsom, and Xi blessed, an alternative leadership in Washington. If anything, he came here to energize the pro-China political and economic forces to make sure that, they hold the sway in internal debates here. And he succeeded in pushing the United States to lift some sanctions early applied to China. So there's an alternative argument like that, saying that he exercised some strength to keep America in check. So I'll be curious where you stand on this, whether he came here, whether he's interested in detente because of a stronger or weaker position at home. And as a result of what he did here in the United States, my real question is whether he was able to succeed in stopping the slide in the bilateral relationship, which we observed in the past couple of years. Did he put it on hold, kind of succeeded in pausing it? Or despite all these kind of agreements on paper, they may not really have any lasting power, and the relationship will continue to go down the hill. So again, to put it kind of straight into your face, a year from now, let alone 5 years from now, will this summit be just a footnote in the history books with very few people remembering what it was about, or will it become something tantamount to the Vienna summits or Geneva summits between the superpowers of the Cold War, with many books have been written on those. So how would you evaluate the historical significance of what we saw a couple of weeks ago here?
All right. Well, I counted 5 questions. I'll start by with regard to this afoot. I think that this was an important, timely summit, but I'll be surprised if it's viewed as having major historical significance 5 years from now. A lot of that will depend on what comes over the next 5 years, how the U.S. political transition or election happens next year, and whether or not there is a kind of spread of what some are calling a multipolar world war. Does the Middle East war grow? What is China's role in it? Is there another conflict that opens somewhere? What happens with the Taiwan election? All of these things, and then are there surprise escalations that come? What happens with Xi on the domestic political front? I think it's really interesting that you point out that there isn't an alternative narrative, or there is another way of looking at it. If you were to look at it from the vantage point of Xi Jinping's power and stature on the world stage, it reminded me of something a good friend of mine at the International Monetary Fund told me probably about 10 years ago. I was asking about China's role in IMF meetings, and this friend just said, the American audience just doesn't understand how well briefed the Chinese are. They show up at these meetings, they're just so well briefed. And I thought, of course they're well briefed. They're an emerging superpower. And what's interesting is on the economic front, that's where their power really lies. If we look at the dime again, this diplomatic, informational, military, and economic sort of paradigm, it's the economic realm where China's real power is. If you look at China, compare China and the United States across the D, the I, and the M, I don't think that the Chinese hold a candle to U.S. diplomatic power in the world, or informational power in the world, or military power. And yet, as you point out, China has more robust trade partnerships with more countries around the world than the United States at this point. And that's just something that the American side has to be wary of. And that's where I think if we are to take a historical perspective and compare these, let's just compare this summit with Xi Jinping and then broadly Trump Xi meetings to the era of the height of the Cold War. Really, this summit, I think, was very characteristic of how different this kind of current Cold War 2.0 moment is from the U.S.-Soviet Cold War, specifically because of China's economic power, one, but also because of the U.S.-China economic relationship. The United States and the Soviet Union did not have an economic relationship. They were competing for ideological influence and territory across the world through Cold War proxy wars and maneuvering. But the idea of outbidding each other with investment in Africa, or trying to get a stronger economic partnership with a couple of key countries in East Asia. This is a very different landscape. And I think that this summit was characteristic of that. And as a result, I think the optics were different. And the optics were also different because of the way that the global media space generates narratives today. Kennedy, Khrushchev, you're talking about one photograph that is just boom, locked down and tattooed into the collective human psyche of anybody who studies that moment in history. With Xi Biden, you're talking about a chaotic media space where it takes time to figure out what actually happened. There's so many different statements. The Biden administration may not have dug into that dynamic of Iranian oil sales to China in this summit. However, there are Biden administration officials that are very happy that we're talking about it right here, because this is actually part of the media optic of what went on in the summit. And there was lots of commentary to get a lot more information about what really went on behind the scenes and what may be on the table in lower level or mid-level talks that hopefully will come. Remember, Jake Sullivan has repeatedly been trying to meet with his Chinese counterparts over the last 2 years, and some pretty high level summitry. That is all carried on to try and kind of get this leader level optic to happen. Just to kind of address one other thing about, did Xi Jinping come from a position of weakness? This is also what's interesting and maybe a little bit ironic here is the timing of this, because it's coming not long after Xi Jinping has really consolidated his power within and above the Communist Party in Beijing, more so than any of his predecessors since Mao Zedong, right? So and I think as there were questions a couple of years ago over whether or not Xi Jinping would be able to achieve that consolidation, Xi was taking a much more confrontational stance towards the West, toward the United States. It was, I think, factoring into his myth about himself in the eyes of the Chinese, how he presented himself as so strong, that he's far stronger than even the world's great superpower. Now that he has consolidated his control of the party, despite all these very real political issues. Remember, it is an authoritarian communist society, a closed media space, but there are real politics in China, very real. There's a battle within the party over who controls, who's next, who influences Xi.
Guy, I'm going to try to interrupt you. Could you keep it to 1 minute, please? Because I want to get into this conversation.
Absolutely.
Guy, go ahead.
I'll leave it there. I think that we maybe are witnessing a posture shift by Xi Jinping at this point. That he's got enough power in Beijing that he's able to engage a little bit more with the United States. It may not just be out of necessity. There could be political motivation behind it.
So, Guy, let me posit this, Guy. I like everything you said, Alexander. Your questions are right on the mark. Guy, look, expectations should be very high between the United States and the People's Republic of China. I mean, we're looking at the potential for conflict in the South China Sea, the East China Sea. You mentioned Taiwan. We have China going into Taiwan's air defense spaces, whether it's the naval, whether it's the air spaces. We see the potential for other issues that speak to, you alluded to intellectual property theft. Certain sectors of their economy are not opening, and so forth. So there's a multitude of issues, and indeed, Hong Kong looms very large. One country, two systems, where the basic law of with reversion in 1997 was nullified by Xi Jinping with the national security law in Hong Kong, Tibet, Xinjiang, and so forth. So yes, there's a multitude of issues here that are not irritants per se, but these are very significant issues that affects our bilateral relationship. And one of the questions I would have for you, Guy, is I think the American people and I think the Chinese people expect our diplomats, our leaders, to be working these issues. Not that we have to have a summit of 4 hours between our two leaders to finally communicate. That should be something that goes on all the time. But the fact of the matter is, historically, whether we see the EP3 incident in 2001, when we were not able to make contact with the Chinese president at that time, Jiang Zemin, or the Belgrade embassy bombing in May of 1999, when we were not able to make contact, in this case with President Clinton, with Jiang Zemin, to talk about an accidental bombing and so forth. So I think what's happened over the years, and I think some people would say this, is our diplomacy has faded, our communications have lapsed, and we're not working these hard issues. We're not working the very difficult issues. Now with fentanyl, we created working groups from this summit. Mm-hmm. Well, let's see where these working groups go. But we need leadership involvement. Let's see where the communications go with the Indo-Pacific Commander. You mentioned that, and so forth. But this needs to be organic, part of the fabric of diplomacy, part of the fabric of great power negotiations, great power coexistence. And this is what we need. And we haven't seen this. We've lapsed. And I think Xi Jinping, his assertiveness has also lent himself a lot to this. You alluded to the COVID and the lockdowns and so forth, but also changes in China, the economic issues that are going on in China. And the fact that the recent, the Party Congress, where Xi Jinping has a third term and possibly president for life. Has this affected the fabric and so forth? So there's so much there. So my question to you is this: has our bar, the element for success, been lowered so that even communicating is now viewed as a success? Shouldn't we be expecting this form of communication? Should we be expecting even more so that we do not stumble into accidental conflict? And should we be keeping that bar high, certainly on the China side and on the U.S. side? And moreover, and I'll end on this question. We look at the BRICS. You talked about the axis of authoritarianism. where China and Russia with Iran and North Korea come together. Well, we have AUKUS, and then AUKUS is doing well, and we've come together very closely with South Korea and with Japan, and that's going very well in extended deterrence. So both sides are sort of working that side. Now, how do we bring those pieces together? Do we want? Obviously, it's going to be a multi, if you will, a lateral world out there. It is. It's more than bipolar. It's multipolar in a lot of ways. It's the global South and so forth. So I guess my question to you, Guy, is: have our standards been lowered such that we're not expecting more of our respective leaders to ensure that we do not stumble into accidental conflict and potentially war? And we're talking about with nuclear weapons. And indeed, you mentioned Taiwan. Where are we in this equation?
Well, it's a great and difficult question, because I think it depends on whether you view China as, or the Chinese government as, a rival or as enemy. And in Washington, in the parliamentary echelon of national security formation, the Congress, there are many at this point who view China as an enemy and are frustrated with what President Biden is attempting to do rhetorically, which is to cast China as a great power rival, that we're in competition, not conflict. We're in competition. So if you embrace the view that, in fact, China is a rival, not an enemy, then I think, yeah, the answer to that question is we absolutely should. We've absolutely lowered the bar, dangerously so, and there absolutely needs to be far deeper diplomatic engagement and discussion on an entire host of issues, whether we're talking about, like I said, pollution and climate change, we're talking about fentanyl, or we're actually digging into really substantial global security issues, like talking openly with the Chinese about this concept that's become really popular in American national security and media narratives of this axis of authoritarians. It's not just Robert Joseph who brought it up here in the Washington brief. You can go to the other side of the ideological spectrum and read Robert Gates's article, more or less the same point, slightly different nuances, in Foreign Affairs magazine just from the past month. This is a popular narrative in Washington, and the fact that there's no question the Chinese are well briefed on it, they're aware of it. The fact that it's not being talked about, or that there isn't an attempt to perhaps encourage China to help break that narrative. You know, if you, what can the United States do to say, well, we'd like to get Xi Jinping to indicate to the world media, the American media, and then hence the U.S. audience and the Chinese audience and everyone else, that in fact China is not in a tight alliance with Russia. That in fact China is worried about the Ukraine war spreading, or that in fact China is capable of openly condemning extremist acts of terrorism. It doesn't have to delve into taking a hard position on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, but condemning the attack on October 7th, that would be a big step. Or that China is worried about the Iranian nuclear program. We've come a long way since the breakdown of the JCPOA. So yeah, I totally agree with you, and I think that these things should be discussed, and I think there should be more dialogue. But I think we also have to watch the shift in power in the United States. Alex, Dr. Mansourov, you brought up this point that Xi Jinping came and got a meeting with Gavin Newsom, showed, that look, he's probably going to be in power for perhaps another 2 presidents in the United States, and he's got to play the landscape here. He's got to show that China understands American politics and is interested in beginning the relationship with another Democratic administration, but also he's got to be prepared for a Republican administration. Difficult task for any powerful world leader trying to interact with the United States. And then we in the United States have to have a strong tissue of I don't want to use the dirty word here, but establishment national security perspectives. We've got to be able to have a national security and diplomatic fabric that can maintain that discussion and those discussions throughout transitions of executive power.
Excellent points, Guy. Those are just outstanding points. Alexander, please, a little response to some of Guy's comments.
Okay, I want to highlight shed some light on one elephant in the room, which we didn't discuss today, and it's a very significant set of developments as we are focused on the Xi-Biden summit. But on the Korean Peninsula, the comprehensive military agreement has been scrapped. Yes. And that's a major development which is likely to fuel tensions on the peninsula. Now, of course, North Korea launched, as Ambassador DeTrani said, successfully a military reconnaissance satellite, which kind of triggered that chain of developments. Also, the Republic of Korea just lost a bid to host the World Expo in 2030, which is a major diplomatic setback for the Yoon administration, despite the major diplomatic campaign, which they mounted to bring it to Busan. Riyadh won the day. And as a result, we are seeing demands for political overhaul in Seoul. They just had a major intelligence leadership shakeup in that country. And so, again, some important developments on the Korean Peninsula with important implications for the geopolitical equation in Northeast Asia. I know we're running out of time, so just one quick question. 1959, Khrushchev had a summit with Eisenhower. 3 years later, Cuban Missile Crisis erupted. So today we have this major summit. Now, do you think 3 years down the road, whether it's the issue of Taiwan, Southeast China, whatever, Xinjiang, whatever, is there any risk at all of something like Cuban Missile Crisis on the horizon in the U.S.-Chinese relationship, in your judgment?
Look, I'm very worried about the prospect of that. Yes, absolutely. The Cuban Missile Crisis, though, stands apart as somewhat unique in bringing the world very close to the brink of nuclear war. I don't know that we have that type of a standoff. I think we've learned a lot as a species, as we would say, about not getting that close to that. But we've heard some pretty inflammatory rhetoric from the Russian government within the context of the Ukraine war about tactical nukes. We do not have Chinese participation in a major non-proliferation agreement or an arms agreement on nuclear weapons, and the type of agreement like START, for instance. I'm not talking about a global contract, but an actual nail it down discussion. So I'm very worried about that. Absolutely, I think we have to see does it involve where's the global economy over the coming 4 or 5 years? What happens with the U.S. election? What are the politics in the United States? And then finally, Alex, just to point out, look, I don't think you mentioned in another development right after the Biden-Xi summit was the announcement of a coming China, Japan, South Korea leaders summit. And this will be the first time in 4 years that China goes to meet with the 2 closest U.S. allies in Northeast Asia. That's also pretty significant. So there's a lot on the table, a lot going on. It's a very fluid and evolving situation.
That's excellent, Guy. No, Alexander, excellent points and good questions. Guy, outstanding responses and commentary. Let me just mention also, you mentioned nuclear, and I couldn't agree with you more, Guy, on this whole issue of nuclear non-proliferation, because we see China really building up its nuclear capability significantly. We're looking at, the possibility of 2030, by 2035, having over 1,550, as we have now, deployed nuclear weapons, et cetera. So there's an issue there. But Alexander also mentioned North Korea. And, this is an area, Guy, that, and for all of us, where China has made a major contribution with the 6-party talks, and Michael introduced this issue here. I was very much involved with those. six-party negotiations. And China hosted the six-party talks, and we did have some progress with that. And hopefully China can bring North Korea back to the table, and North Korea can stop with, producing more nuclear weapons, more fissile material for these nuclear weapons, and potentially even having a seventh nuclear test. But there are so many issues where not only should the U.S. and China be looking to defuse some of the issues, whether it be Taiwan, the South China Sea, the Southeast China Sea, whether it be the whole issue of national security law in Hong Kong, one country, two systems, et cetera, but also opportunities, as you mentioned, Guy, to cooperate on climate control, on pandemics, certainly on North Korea, on global issues, the whole food security issue that affects the global South, economic development in the global South. So there are so many opportunities. And that's, I think, where it's a bit aspirational, but I think that's where a lot of people are looking at where China and the People's Republic of the U.S. and the People's Republic of China can come together and start not only to diffuse the issues that are possibly lending itself to stumbling into conflict, accidental conflict, but also areas where we can cooperate and show the world that we do work together for the common good. And that's an important element to this to these discussions. So, Guy, this was a great discussion. You bring a lot to it. I can't say enough about your insight. I read you all the time in the Washington Times. You really know the area and the global issue well. Alexander, you're just outstanding as usual. Dr. Jenkins, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I cannot be more happy with any of our Washington Brief programs as we are today. So much detail, so much clarity. We want to thank Guy Taylor, National Security Team Leader for the Washington Times. Excellent. And I can see your advanced studies and graduate studies and your master's degree and all the work you're doing is really adding to a very, very high level, not only analysis, but also an influence. Your columns are influencing things in a good way. We really appreciate you, Guy. I want to thank Dr. Mansourov, as always, with his insights, profound insights, especially with his international background. And Ambassador DeTrani, I do believe the six-party talks laid a foundation that we're still standing on, and I think that it can be renewed. We can never stop engagement. Right. I was very encouraged by today's program. I came away with a very different mindset on the Biden-Xi summit. I think there was more actually accomplished than we fully realized. So thank you all. I want to thank the Washington Times, Chris Dolan, the president. They always make extra effort to cover these briefs, and that helps us have a voice that goes directly to Northeast Asia and many of the journals that are there. I want to thank Sunwal Reiner, too, as our technical advisor. She's doing a wonderful work with the Washington Brief, and Larry Moffat, of course. And we really look forward to our next session. Be here every Tuesday of the month. Of every month, and we're going on our third anniversary, by the way. I'm quite amazed. That's coming in a few months. I want to thank you all. Thank you.